Greetings everyone and welcome to the Maya 101 class for the 4th week. Today is Tuesday the 17th of July, at least for a little while longer in my particular part of the world. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at rigging and animation. Now, I want to stress some very important things to you right now. Rigging and animation are huge topics. I could teach an entire 8 to 12 to 16 week class in rigging alone. Animation, as you might have already gathered, is also a huge topic. So what you're going to get tonight is a crash course to make you dangerous, to kind of teach you the basics of what's going on and get our little cherry character all rigged up so that you can animate him. What I'd like to do is dedicate the first half of this class to the rigging process. If we have to run over a little bit, that's okay. And then the back end of the class will be all about getting things animated. So without too much more than that, let's go ahead and jump in. Here's a quick rundown of some of the key topics we're going to be hitting on tonight. First off, will be grouping. Now, we've already seen grouping after a fashion in this class, just the whole creation of a group and parenting objects to that object. But we're going to talk about the importance of grouping just in terms of a character. At the end, we're going to be grouping some objects together so that they move as one. Also, I want to talk about custom attributes, which we haven't seen yet. So how to control stuff with your very own attributes. We're going to take a look at deformers. We're going to take a look at constraints. Make one object follow some aspect of something else. And kind of as a derivative of constraints, after a fashion, we're going to take a look at motion paths. And then finally, when all that's done, we're going to look at the concepts of animation. Specifically, keyframe animation. Okay, and, well, anyway, let's just go ahead and jump on into Maya. So you should have a scene that looks vaguely like this. Now, I'm going to not actually show any of my shading, so I'm actually going to go under the shading menu and just turn on... Is it under the shading menu or is it under the lighting menu? No, it is under shading. Oh, use default material doesn't work under high quality. That's why I'm losing my mind. Let me just go back to the default quality rendering, and I'm just going to go just switch on use default material. Just keep everything nice and gray, no distractions. Now, on your end, if you don't want to do that, that's fine. I'm just doing it so things don't get any kind of jittery. All right. Now, here is our cherry, and hopefully you've got something vaguely like this that you'd like to go ahead and get animated in your scene. There's something I'd like you to do, however, and that is take your stem, and if your stem has a bit of a lean to it, the way mine does, I want you to rotate it around so that that stem points backwards down the z-axis. Now, why, you might ask? It's simply because we're going to be animating in a Z forward direction. Basically, if I get my move tool out, our cherry is going to be moving this way. And I kind of want that stem to be pointing backwards to give him a little more emphasis of speed. Now, if you don't want to do that, that's fine. It's your animation. You're welcome to change things up as you like. But placement is going to be important, so let's start off. I'm going to turn this not into... a side view at the moment. Just pull it backwards along the z-axis and set it down on the table. So get the cherry back here and set him down on the table. His exact positioning isn't going to be super relevant because we're going to be changing that around quite a bit as we move forward, but anywhere back here will do. And for now, I'm going to hide the table. Just hit Control H so we can just focus in on the cherry. As a matter of fact, I'm going to select the cherry and hit F. Now, the rigging process, when you are creating a character rig, what is a character rig, first off? We need a definition. A character rig, I mean, some of you might be thinking, if you've ever heard the term character rigging, maybe you've got a little bit of feedback, or maybe you've been working in 3D for a minute, or you've been exposed to it, and a lot of you are probably thinking a character rig is always some sort of human skeleton with stuff hanging off of it that you can use to animate a character. Well, that certainly is a type of rig, but really a rig is, or can be, any system designed to simplify animation on an object. So try to think of a rig as a very generic thing, as something that you can build for any object. It doesn't have to be a skeleton. Some rigs, like the one we're going to do tonight, don't even have any bones in them. We're going to build a rig completely without a skeleton. We're just going to use some of Maya's tools and create a system by which we can move our cherry around, we can squash him and stretch him, and still have nice controls to waggle his little stem upside down as well. Upside down. Well, waggle it up and down, excuse me. So that's what a rig is. Now let's talk about the rig that we're going to create for our cherry, because really the first part of any rig, and it's probably the most important part by far, because really from here on out it's just assembly, is planning. You really need some sort of a plan before you jump into any rig. And if you were doing this entirely from scratch, that was like the worst cherry I think I've ever tried to start drawing. It's just awful. This one's not too much better. But so we've got this little cherry character, and he's got his little stem. Now, what do we really need this to do? And this may be something you'll want to do on your end when you're creating your own rigs. You'll want to take a minute and consider, all right, we need him to move. All right, that's easy enough. He's got to move around the scene. This cherry's not going to sit still. He's going to be bouncing. As a matter of fact, you could be more specific and say he's bouncing. Now, as a part of that bouncing, we want him to be able to squash and stretch. Squashing and stretching is a form of secondary animation. I'll write that in here. That makes objects feel more cartoony, but also, simultaneously a bit more realistic. It just gives them a little bit more life and presence. So we're definitely going to be taking a look at squash and stretch. And we want his stem to be able to wag as well. So we want that to be able to wave up and down and move that, which is also a form of secondary animation. Now, if you're wondering what's the difference between, if this is secondary animation, what's primary animation? Well, if we consider what we want to have happen here, if I drew a side profile of our scene, and I'll say, here's our cake. My drawing skills are just off tonight. They were switched off earlier today for some reason. And we have our little cherry here, and we want him to do a bounce, and then one great big bounce, and then land on top of the cake. That's the motion that we're looking for. And you should always try to take a moment and plan out motion like this, plan out what you want to have happen in your animation, because the plan of the animation can also help define your rig. For instance, if you're rigging up a character, an actual human being style character, and you put a lot of controls to make it really easy for him to run and fling himself around like Spider-Man, where he's really super duper ultra mega flexible, and it turns out, excuse me, that all that character does is walk across a small area of the background, you spent a lot of time setting up a rig that you don't necessarily need. Now, in some cases these days, there are automated rigs for that sort of thing. So if that's your quick response, well, what about human IK or an automated rig? Well, that changes things. Obviously, it's a bit of a game changer. So, what we want to be able to set up is a nice, convenient system where we can grab a single object without grabbing the geometry itself. I'm a big stickler in just when I'm doing rigging that I think a rig should abstract away from the actual geometry. Now, what do I mean exactly when I say that? Well, if you consider the cherry to actually be this guy that I've drawn here, so this is a NURB surface, and it's got all the isoparms, and maybe you got a little polygon stem up here. I do not want you to ever select this geometry and move the geometry around. Don't ever give an animator, or you yourself if you're the animator, don't ever give them the power to touch or mess around with your actual geometry if you don't have to, because you never know if they're going to tap the delete key and then heaven forbid keep on working or be unable to undo or end up screwing something up in some other way. So you want to keep your geometry more or less off limits. Now we're not going to take that and go overboard with it. I mean, we're not going to go to the point where we're completely locking every single aspect, but we are going to abstract away where you're not going to be animating the geometry itself. Instead, we're going to create a master control object that will represent everything we want to do to the cherry. So if we started there, I could just kind of draw out sort of a rough version of the rig. We're going to create this master control object out of a locator. And for those of you who haven't seen a locator, it's really just a three-way cross in space. Now we're going to put it at the base of the object. Really, that's just a matter of preference, so that as we animate this locator moving through space, because really you could at this point ignore the fact that we have a cherry and just consider animating this little three-way locator, which is just a little cross. But by using that, we can place this locator right down on the table each time we do a bounce. If we had our locator here in the center of our object, think about it. What we'd have to do is animate this locator up and down on the table, but we'd have to stop it short of actually touching the table. It would maybe stop here on each bounce, and we don't want to do that. We want it to go all the way down to the table. So really, we could create a very simple rig just like that. As a matter of fact, let's just do it. Let's go over to Maya right now. And let's create a locator that sits right here at the base of our cherry. It's very easy to do. We'll go to Create and drop on a locator. Now our locator just popped up at the center of the world, and that's not necessarily the most useful place for it. And if you want to bring it over here, how do you get it to perfectly line up with the top of the cherry? There's a lot of different ways where you could be manually moving stuff, but I want to show you a trick. If you want to be able, if you just want to move it on your own, just slide it back here in Z, that's perfectly fine. What I'm going to do instead is tap the 4 key and go to wireframe. Now, if you hold down the C key, notice I'm slowing down the rate of my speech because this is important. If you hold down the C key and then middle mouse drag on any of these isoparms while the center of the move tool is selected, you are curve snapping. So just take your move tool and click on the little yellow box in the middle of it, hold down the C key, and then middle mouse click on these longitudinal lines, and you can snap your locator right down there to the center of your cherry. So go ahead and do that right now. And I'll go ahead and pause the video so folks can catch up. Okay, so we've got that. Now let's get this named. So, of course, there's a lot of different ways to name an object. I'm going to go over here to the channel box and just click on the name locator1 and change this to cherry_control. I will often abbreviate that to CTRL, but we'll just type it all out to control for this first one. Now here's the simple first step in our rig. I'm going to grab the stem and the body of the cherry and our locator and tap the P key. And that's it. We have an initial object that you could argue is a very, very simple rig in that it allows us to move two objects at the same time, thereby simplifying our animation process. Now, of course, that's not everything that we want our rig to do. Okay. Now, I don't want there to be a whole lot of confusion. Really all I was doing there was showing you the parenting just for the fact that we could just parent this and use the locator to move things around. But I'm going to unparent everything. Now, there's a lot of different ways we can do this. I want to show you the process over inside of the hypergraph. So if we go over here to the hierarchy listing, or hierarchy, excuse me, we'll see the P cylinder, which I need to rename to stem, and the cherry body. So I'm just going to middle mouse drag those away, and that unparents. So you have no more parenting. And let's get these renamed. So usually for actual pieces of geometry, I have a habit of using the geo prefix. So geo_cherry_body. And then also do geo underscore cherry underscore stem. So that's nicely named, and we can tell what each object is just by looking at its node. But again, nothing is parented anymore. Another way to go about that, if you had these parented as we did a second ago, is to grab the two children, like so, and just hit Shift P, and that will unparent them. Those like parent and anti-parent. Okay, the next part of the rig I want to tackle is going to be the squashing and stretching mechanism. And this is where we get into the topic of deformers. Now, what is a deformer in Maya? It's an object that changes, oh no, that was right, that changes the shape of some other object. So it's just an object that changes the shape of some other object. A long time ago, it used to just, you could say that it was an object that changes the shape of geometry. But these days you can apply a deformer to a particle system and to all sorts of other stuff like that. So I'll just say it changes the shape of some other object. So what I want you to do is go back over to Maya. I want you to select your cherry body. Press F2 to make sure you're under the animation menu set, or by all means, grab it out of the drop down if you want to. And there's a Create Deformers menu. Click on that. And about halfway down, you'll see Non-Linear. So Create Deformers, Non-Linear, and there is a Squash Deformer. Click on that. Now, if we take a look at what we've created, it's just this little line that has little crosses coming out of each end of it. But if we take a look at the input nodes, we'll see Squash 1. Now, I'm going to give you guys a couple of tips. If you now select the body of your cherry and you go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, you lose that deformer. Deformers are historically dependent. They use construction history, and without construction history, they no longer exist. So, I want you to select your cherry, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and delete history, just so I know you've got no history tagging along, and then just recreate your deformer real fast. It's just a nice way for me to double check and make sure nobody had any excess history that's bogging them down. So back to Create, Deformers, Non-Linear, and drop on a Squash Stretch. Okay, so now underneath the inputs, let's click on Squash 1. And there's a lot of different attributes here, but the one I want you to take a look at is Factor. Click on Factor, and then as you use your middle mouse button, you can see what this is doing. It is literally just squashing and stretching the body of the cherry, which is pretty cool. The only real problem with it is if we look at it from the side, which, I mean, we can just rotate and get really close to that, is that it is not squashing and stretching from the bottom. Now, this is a tiny character and fast animation, so that's not too much of an issue. However, the real problem comes to be if we set our locator, this guy, our master control, down on the table, and we lower our squash factor, look what happens. The cherry's going to pull away from the surface of the table. Evan Bush just asked, can you parent inside the hypergraph? You can indeed. If I was to middle mouse drag one object on top of another, that parents. And dragging them away will unparent. That's actually one of my favorite ways to parent when I have complex connections to make and I don't want to bother with selections. Okay, so what we want to do is make sure that our squashing is taking place from the base or from the bottom where our locator is. So I'm going to set my factor back over to 0. And this is just an object. It's really all, it's just its own thing with its own location. Now, if your stem, so the stem doesn't like to stick around with the squash stretch. No, it doesn't. Don't worry about that yet. That's another part of the rig we have to tackle completely separately. I'm going to take my squash handle, though, and pull it down so that it's basically sitting right on top of that locator. Now if I play with factor, notice where we're squashing and stretching from. Alright, it's a start. Watch this. If I increase my factor to about 0.6, I can then start playing with my high bound and my low bound. If I increase my high boundary and pull back on my low boundary, so notice I pulled my low bound to about negative 0.01 and high bound to about 1.9. Now when I play with factor, we're getting squashing and stretching that feels much more bottom-centric. So there's really 3 steps there. We moved the handle, the actual squash handle, so that it was lined up right with our locator. So you can see I just moved it straight down until it was sitting on top of the locator. Then I took the low boundary, and all that is, it defines this cross down here on the bottom, and I snugged that up a little bit to about negative 0.1. Then I took the high boundary, and I increased that until it went up past the top of the cherry. So that now my factor squashes and stretches more from the bottom of the cherry. And I'll go ahead and pause the video and let people get to that point. Marco just asked, can the handle of the deformer be snapped to something? Absolutely. It is just like any other object with its own transform. You could hold down the V key and snap it directly to your locator, and it's really not a bad idea. We could just press W. I mean, I generally would like to move it away slightly, and if you want to see something neat, start moving your deformer around. Anyway, and then we can hold down the, I would just go into wireframe at that point. And then hold down V and middle mouse click right in the center of that locator, and that'll snap it right to that location. So there you go. And when you're done, you should be able to take your factor, and if you set it to 0, you'll basically just get your cherry. And as you use your middle mouse to drag it up and down, you'll just get some nice squash and stretch that is centered more toward the bottom of the cherry, so that you're not pulling away from the control locator. Okay, so you've got a cherry that can squash and stretch, but obviously there's still some problems. The first one right now being that if we take our master control object, our cherry control, and move it around, obviously nothing is parented along, so that's a bit of a problem. Let's go ahead and solve that at this time. Now, the way we're going to solve that is really twofold. We're going to take our cherry body and our squash and stretch handle, and we're going to parent that to the control. So here's what I want to do. I want to actually do that in the hierarchy view, just so you can see manually what's going on here. Make it a little easier to visualize. So here's our cherry control. Here's our cherry body. I can even kind of zoom out a little bit and show you each one as I select them. There's the control. There's our cherry body. And here's our squash handle. In fact, let's go ahead and rename this. Let's just select it, and this will be... I'm going to give that a prefix of def for deformer. Cherry underscore squash stretch. Once I've done that, I'll middle mouse drag the cherry body on top of cherry control, and that just parents them. Then I'm going to take the squash handle and middle mouse drag that on top of the control as well. So now you can see my hierarchy. You can do this just by selecting both the cherry body and the squash handle, then selecting the cherry control and hitting P. It's exactly the same thing. But however you want to handle it is fine with me. If you accidentally had parenting that was like this, where you've got the squash handle parented to the cherry body, the cherry body parented to the cherry control, that wouldn't be the end of the world. I wouldn't do it that way, but I have no solid reasoning why other than personal preference. Aside from the fact that if you borked something on the geometry, it could end up screwing up your deformer. So it does add a little bit of a degree of separation, but it's really not the end of the world if you had that kind of stair-step sort of hierarchy. Now at this point, if we select our cherry control and we move it, of course the cherry comes along, and if we select our squash handle and play with its factor, we squash and stretch from whatever our location was. So that's already helping us out quite a bit. But there's a problem, and I just identified it by having to do a whole bunch of extra clicks. Can anybody tell me what a fundamental problem of our rig is right now? Ignoring the stem. We're not to the stem yet. Something I just did that seemed like a whole lot more work than it really needed to be. Anybody want to take a guess? There's a cookie in it for whoever follows along. And I got nothing. Alright, the problem that we had is no clue. Alright, that's fine. It was a whole lot of work for us to adjust our squash and stretch. Look at this. I've got to select our squash handle. Then I got to dig down into the input node. Then I got to select factor. And then I got to waggle my middle mouse. Like, what was it, 4 steps just to get to a single little feature of our rig? That's horrible. We don't want that. So what we're going to do is change the attributes that are available on Cherry Control and add a new one to allow us to adjust for our squash stretch. Now there's a few things that I like to do with a rig before I start adding custom attributes, is I will verify the ones that are there and make sure that I need to have them. For instance, do I ever really need to show or hide this object? Actually, I don't, because if I ever don't want these to show, I would just go to Show and turn off locators, and suddenly you wouldn't be able to see it anymore. So, do I need to scale this up or down? No, that's all been decided. So what I'm going to do is select Scale X and then drag down all the way to Visibility, hold down my right mouse button, and I can lock these. I don't really need to, but I can. We can just hide them, and that's going to be good enough. Or you can say, if you never want those to be adjusted, you can say lock and hide selected. Let me show you what each one does, though. So if I lock them, you see they get grayed out, and I can't adjust scale. As a matter of fact, look at my scale tool right now. It's completely grayed out. Nor can I change visibility. If I hide them, then those objects will just not show in the channel box. They are still there, and they can be found in the attribute editor, but they're not in the channel box. Do you remember way back in our first discussion, I told you that the channel box is really all about animatable attributes. If you don't want to animate those objects anymore, those attributes, you might as well get rid of them. So I'm going to right-click and go down to Hide and get rid of them. So now all I have here is just Translate and Rotate. I can do the same thing with the shape node attributes for local position and local scale. If I'm happy with the size of my locator, which, by the way, just a little side feature, if you want your locator to be bigger or smaller, use the shape node and grab local scale X, Y, and Z. It's far more efficient and doesn't actually adjust any of your scales. But once I'm happy with those, I'll get rid of those too. So right-click, lock and hide selected. So now all we have here is Translate and Rotate. Just what we need. Now, our next step is going to be to add an attribute to allow us to squash and stretch the cherry. Here's how you add an attribute. And before I do this, let me let people catch up real quick. All right, so now we're going to add a custom attribute. Select your Cherry Control object. I'm going to Modify and choose Add Attribute. And you should get this window. Like so. Now, we are going to keep this very, very simple. We just want to give this a name. And the name we are going to choose is just Squash. If you want to, you could throw a capitalization here. So lowercase squash, capitalize the S, and then do stretch, and I'll show you what happens. So if you do squash stretch, this can be a float, so don't change anything else. You should the data type should be float, and leave everything else alone. Don't worry about a min and a max or a default value. Just go ahead and click OK. Maya notices that casing, and so now you get squash stretch. Okay. Now, we could do what we're about to do with the node editor, which would be fun, but just in case, we're going to, since it's a brand new thing for Maya 2013, let's go ahead and use the old school connection editor just for a moment. Let's go to Window, or maybe I'll do both. So let's go to Window, General Editors, and whip open the Connection Editor, which is halfway off my screen. So let me adjust its size so that stops happening. I changed resolution, so nothing in my computer knows where it should be right now. Now, on the left-hand side, we have Cherry Control, and that's perfect. If you don't have that on the left-hand side for some reason, select the Cherry Control and click the Reload Left button. You also want to make sure this little central button here says from left to right. So you want this little arrow here pointing to the right. Now, for a cookie, what are we loading on the right-hand side, anybody? Who gets the cookie? Factor, that's close. Squash, that's right, the squash handle. We are grabbing the deformer, which is actually what I was looking for. But squash 1 is just as good. So select that and click Reload Right. We're going to be sending data from Cherry Control to the squash handle. Now, here's where things get a little bit funny. If you just select the squash handle and click Reload Right, something very interesting just happened, and it's really easy to overlook, and it will frustrate you. So I wanted to make sure everybody got a chance to do this, because if I just do it right the first time, 1, 2, or 15 of you will get really, really frustrated. By default, Maya likes to load in the actual node, in this case the transform node, and what we need is the shape node. I'm sorry, we need the input node for squash 1. Because right now, like every object in Maya, this squash handle is made up of multiple nodes. It has an input node, it has a shape node, and it has a transform node. And what we want is the input node because that's where the factor attribute lies. But how do we get to that? How do we put that into the connection editor? There are a lot of ways, actually. Here's the easiest that doesn't force you to have to open up the hypergraph and look at a whole bunch of nodes, which you can do if you want to. Generally what I do is I open up the attribute editor. You'll see squash 1 in there, and you'll know it's the right node because it's got factor right there, and you can play with the slider and waggle that up and down, and that's perfect, of course. That's exactly what you want. Now here's a nice little feature of the attribute editor you may not have known was there. There's a little select button down here. Click on this, and whatever node you had selected here in the attribute editor is actually selected inside of Maya. So, click on squash 1 so that you see the factor attribute, then click on the select button in the attribute editor, then back here in connection editor, click Reload Right again. Now you see all of the attributes that you wanted to see. Now the process is simple. On the left-hand side, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see your squash stretch attribute. Here on the right-hand side, click on Factor. The connection is already made. You're actually done. Now if I break that connection and just do the whole thing over again, here's how we do it. Window, General Editors, Connection Editor. On the left-hand side, select your control object and click Reload Left. For the right-hand side, however, we need the input node because the input node is where the factor attribute actually lies. So we go to the attribute editor, select squash 1, and click the select button. That just tells Maya, hey, this input node, that's exactly what I want to select. So we click that, and then click Reload Right. So we're literally loading the input node into the right-hand side of the connection editor. Then it's just click on squash stretch, click on factor, connection made, you can close the window. Now comes the fun part, you get to test it. So if you select your master control, you can click on squash stretch, middle mouse drag, and there you go. Yes, you can just click it in the channel box and reload it right from there. That doesn't always seem to work for some people, and some people will end up automatically trying to rename the shape node. So yeah, I have kind of simplified methods, or sometimes not simplified methods, just to make things a little easier to follow if you're doing them on your own. See, now the great thing is that our rig is becoming much more functional. We can move our cherry around wherever we want it to be, and at any point we have instant access to squashing and stretching. And I'd like to go ahead and give everybody a second to catch up to this point. Now, while people are following along and finishing all of this up, what I'd like to do is you just keep working. If you're still trying to get all that connected, just keep on doing it. I'm going to go to General Editors, open the Connection Editor back up. Let's go ahead and load back in my control. Let me go ahead and grab my input node, load that up. There's squash 1 sitting right there. And I'm going to break that connection. So if I click on squash stretch, you see factor highlighted. Just click on factor again and it breaks that connection. And let's see, Ryan Tremel said the connection editor is used for animating properties. So what you're saying is that one attribute can be transferred between multiple assets. That's exactly what I'm saying. One attribute can drive multiple assets, but not the other way around. So when here, let me go ahead and just do a quick diagram. When we're using the connection editor the way we've been doing it, we have our host node, or let's see, how would I put this? Well, you just do host and slave, or master and slave, however you wanted to do it. Driver and driven, if you wanted to take the SDK route. So this would be our driving object. And then we have our driven object. And we can send data from any attribute over into any other attribute. You just have to be a little careful, because like if you wanted to take like position and feed it into something like, I don't know, something like factor, you have a little bit of a problem. Position is actually 3 numbers for X, Y, and Z. Factor is only 1 number. So you've got to reconcile these 3 numbers into one singular value, perhaps by taking a mathematical average between them, take the result of that, and feed that over. Now you can do all of that through nodes, but that's some critical thinking. My point is that we could have other driven objects, and we can drive multiple objects. However, we can't do it the other way around, meaning we can't have 2 drivers. So here's a driver, and here's a driver, and here's a driven. They both cannot be affecting the exact same attribute. They can both be affecting the same object. One object has a lot of different attributes. But you can't have 2 different things affecting the same object. Now again, you can find a workaround. So we could take the output from 2 driving objects, from 2 drivers. We could add them together with the use of nodes and take the result and plug that in. So I mean, there's workarounds to that sort of thing. But it's a one-way connection, which goes back to kind of Maya's actual architecture. Okay, real quick. Let me go to Window and open up the node editor. And so here's the node editor. And then I'm going to go to Window and open up, we could start here. So we'll begin with Cherry Control, and I'm just going to middle mouse drag that over here into the node editor. And then I'm going to grab my squash stretch and show its upstream and downstream connections, or input and output connections. And there's squash 1, so there's my input node. Just middle mouse drag that in as well. So now both of those are loaded up in the node editor. So now I can take squash stretch as an output, plug that right into factor, and I've done the exact same job. So it's actually kind of a nice way to get around it. Now, let's see. Chris says, my cherry no longer deforms in the X or Z axis when squashing. It just squishes in Y. My guess... Now, was it doing that like early on and then it suddenly stopped for some reason? Because it sounds like your expand might have got pushed to 0. So if you mean you're just getting this kind of upward scale, you probably set expand to 0 when you thought you were working with factor. So set expand back to 1 and then adjust your squash stretch property again, and everything should be working. Okay, cool. That took care of it. All right, now continuing along, because it looks like pretty much everybody got caught up while I showed how the node editor could connect all of that up. And if you need to watch that, of course, there's always the video. What we're going to do now, though, is kind of branch off. So we have got our squash stretch behavior. And if we think of our rig for our character here, so here's our cherry rig. There's really two major components of it that we want to rig up. And rather than make a guess as to what they are, one is the cherry body, which really just needs to move and squash and stretch. Then we also have the stem, which needs to waggle around. So what we're going to do is jump over now and focus on making this happen. Then we'll make this entire waggling system follow along with what's going on over here. We're not actually going to use a bend in this case because the object is so simple. We will get a bend result from the final animation just by adding a little bit of rotation. And I think you'll find that's going to make the animation look just as good, but significantly simpler. So it'll be easier to do, but you won't have to do as much work to make it happen. Okay, so let's just focus on the stem for a minute. What we want to have happen here is to have some sort of control that we can just grab here at the tip of the stem and move it around, and the stem just follows. Now, if you had at some point left the curve in that you used to extrude this, you'd already kind of have some sort of control over doing that, but that's dangerous. If something ever happens to that curve, then your whole piece of geometry disappears. So make sure you select this piece of geometry, go to Edit, Delete by Type, and kill your history. Do not do Edit, Delete All by Type history. Do not do that, because you'll lose your deformer and all this work you've been doing up to this point. Now, history deletion becomes dangerous and a careful thing that you've got to consider. Okay. So how are we going to animate the stem? Well, what I want you to do first off is to take your cherry control and select it. Let's go to Modify and choose Freeze Transformations. And is that even going to work right now? Let me check and see what my Freeze Transformations is set to. It is, but it's probably because it's already got things parented to it. It's not going to want to get frozen. That's okay. We'll leave it right where it is, and we'll just animate it later. I was just looking for a nice, convenient way to hide it. So let's see. If I just hit Control H, well, that's locked, so that won't do it either. I'm just going to slide this out of the way. Well, no, I could do it this way. Let me go to Show. There's all kinds of ways to handle this. Let's just go to Show, and I'll turn off NURB surfaces, and I'm going to turn off deformers. I'll leave locators on, and you'll see why here in just a minute. Can you mark things undeletable? You can set up some asset properties that will prevent that sort of thing, but that's a little bit outside of our scope. Okay, so now we are going to rig up the stem. So what I want you to do is get over to a side view. Now to do this, I'm going to hold down the space bar and just click on the little Maya logo here in the center and just go to side view. And where does that leave me? There's my stem. It's actually bending in the opposite direction, but that's fine. It's an orthographic view, and that's easy to work with. Makes me very happy. So now go to Create, and I want you to draw a CV curve that follows the shape of the stem as closely as you can manage. It does not have to be perfect. Just click, maybe click here, here. Notice I'm going outside the body of the stem, and that's pretty good. That's about all you really need. Now, once you're happy, press Enter, and of course if you need to, you can hold down the right mouse button out here and just move your control vertices around to tweak the shape. You do not need absolute perfection, however. So go ahead and get a NURBS curve put in, and I'll give everybody just a second to catch up to that. Okay, so now we have our curve. What I want you to do now is right-click and choose Curve Point. A curve point is literally just that. It is a point somewhere, an arbitrary location along the curve, and I want you to drag this little point, and you'll see it's a little red dot, just drag it all the way to the end of the curve where the tip of your stem is. This is going to be used as a selection point. You're basically pointing at this point on your curve, saying, hey Maya, we're about to do something right here at this location. I want you to go to Create Deformers and click on Point on Curve. That creates a locator right at the location of the tip of your stem. As soon as that happens, name this locator. This will be control underscore cherry underscore stem. Now, because I'm a little nitpicky, I'm going to take the local scale in my shape node and pull that down a little bit. You do not have to do that. That's completely optional. Something that isn't optional, though, is to center up the pivot on this object. Because right now, if you've hit your move tool or your rotate tool, you've probably noticed that you don't see your manipulator. It's because they're really far away. So, with your locator selected, go to Modify and choose Center Pivot. Now watch what happens when you move this locator around. See how your little curve just bends and flexes? That's the first part of our control. In a way, that's kind of the skeleton of our stem. We're going to turn that curve into a wire that will deform the actual shape of our geometry. And here's how we do that. Deselect everything. Go back over to Create Deformers, and you'll see Wire Tool. So again, Create Deformers, Wire Tool. Click on that. Now in this case, the help line tells you everything you need from this point out. It says, select shapes to deform and press Enter. So we select the body of the stem, because that is what we are deforming, and press Enter. Select the wire curves and press Enter to finalize the operation. Zoom in real close, select your curve, and press Enter. You're done. Now select your locator and move it again. You've now rigged up your stem. So I want to give everybody just another second. I'm going to pause this, and then people can catch up. For this. Moving the new locator only deforms up to the next control vertex and no further, unlike yours, which seems to have a much greater area of effect. It's probably because you have a whole lot of CVs in your curve, and this is only going to work on single curve segments. So in that case, simplify your curve. Build another one that only has 4 CVs. Even if it means you have to go a little bit outside the geometry of your stem, it won't matter. It'll be just fine. Because in the end, we're not doing a heavy amount of animation here. We're just going to be using this so that this guy waggles. I mean, you're looking at about the extent of what I have in mind right here. So if your stem does a lot of like S-curving or whatever, just get kind of an average curve that goes through most of it, and you should be good to go. Okay, so we've got the motion in our stem, but we kind of need to unify our stem. And let's go back to a perspective view here. And take a look at this from multiple angles. You can see how my curve deformer, or sorry, my curve, is going a little bit outside my geometry because my stem apparently like swiveled a little bit off to the side, but it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. So that's perfectly fine. Now, what I'd like to do is put all of this into a group, and I want to show you something that happens here. If I just select my curve, watch what happens when I try to move my curve. And actually, my curve's pivot point is really far away, so I'm going to, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you do this, but because I'm just showing you something. But I'm going to select my curve, and once again, go to Modify and center its pivot. Now, watch this when I move the curve. See how it kind of fights its end, tries to stay in that position? Now you could really use that to your advantage, but I do want to kind of point something out to you. If we try to move the geometry, you can get all kinds of weird stuff. As a matter of fact, watch this. If I pull my stem down and then start moving the geometry, you can get all kinds of really crazy stuff. So what we're going to do is group all of this together, and it will create a problem. I just want to point that out. So select your geometry, select your curve, and select your locator, and hit Control-G. And we're going to call this group underscore stem. Now, if we try to move this group, look what happens. This is double transformation. The reason this is happening is because we are moving our locator and we are moving our curve. Now, what do our curve and our locator actually do? What's the purpose of them? Why are they there? They are there to move our geometry. However, we're also moving the geometry, so we end up with double transformation. There is a way to fix this, and it's really important for me to show you how that works. Once you've got your group created, and you can verify that by selecting any one of the objects and tapping the up arrow key, so you should have the group for the stem. In fact, I'm just going to change the name here. This will be group underscore cherry underscore stem. Again, that's Control G for group. Now, select just the stem geometry itself and jump over to your attribute editor. In the transform node, so you'll see Geo Cherry Stem if you're using the same name that I am, and you'll know it's the transform node because it's the only node that has translate, rotate, and scale. You'll see inherits transform. Turn that off. So by turning that off, the transform node is essentially not doing anything in this case. And this stem is only being affected by the location of this locator and by the curve. That's it. You now have a rigged stem. So, just as a quick reminder, and what I'll do real quick is I'll grab this guy and I'm going to go to Edit and just choose Ungroup to obliterate that group. We grab the locator, the curve, and the stem, and we hit Control G. We renamed this to group underscore cherry underscore stem, like so. However, when we try to move that group, we get problems because by default this was on. So if you just group them, you'll get weirdness like this. To solve the weirdness, select the stem, select whatever it is that's going crazy, and switch off inherits transform. Then you can move the group wherever you want it to. Your last step will be to move the pivot point of the group to the base of the stem. To do this, I'm going to hold down D. By the way, holding down D temporarily allows you to move the pivot of an object. And if I combine that with C for curve snapping, I can hit D and C and then just curve snap this guy right down here to the end of my curve, and that's perfect. However you want to do it, you can move it manually all you want to. I just want to make sure that my pivot point for the group is right here at the base of the stem. That will be important. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and let people catch up. Alright, so we've got a completely self-contained group with our stem that allows us to waggle the stem around. Now I'm going to go back to show, and let's turn back on NURB surfaces, and let's turn back on, well actually we can leave deformers off at this point, we don't really need to see them at all. We could even go to show and turn off NURB's curves if we really wanted to, and now all we see is just these two locators, which is pretty neat. But our problem is this. If we squash and stretch, our stem gets separated and doesn't follow along. We are going to solve this problem in two different ways. So basically a two-step process. First off, you need to be passively familiar with the concept of a motion path. A motion path is the ability to take an object, which will be this box for the purposes of example, and attach it to a NURBS curve. So that the box travels along this like railroad tracks. It's very easy to set up inside of Maya. As a matter of fact, you can follow along with this if you really want to, but I'm going to be deleting it in a moment anyway. What I'm going to do is go to Create, CD Curve Tool, and let's just make a curve. Oh, it'd probably help if I showed NURBS curves again, wouldn't it? So, create a curve that does some stuff. Perfect. It's the best curve ever. Hit 3 to make it look even prettier. Now let's make some piece of geometry. So I don't even care what. Polygon primitives. Let's make a cube. That's kind of like what we were doing a second ago. So draw out a tiny little cube. Fantastic. Now watch this action. This is amazing to me. Okay, we select our cube. We select our curve. Go to animate. So it's not under create deformers. This time it's under animate. And you'll see motion paths. And choose attach to motion path. Just hit play. Actually, are you even going to play for me? Or do I need to update your U value manually? I'm updating the U value manually. Are you moving at all? Hang on, let me double check something. Let's go to animate, motion paths, and let's take a look at the options here. Oh, all we did was attach to the start. Let me reset my settings. That's what it should be by default. So you guys probably already got something that worked. So what I'm going to do is tap undo. Apparently I was changing my settings at heaven only knows what point that I was using Maya. So let's go back to animate, motion paths, attach to motion path, and I'll go to options and just reset the settings and then click attach. And now look at this. We're flying along the curve. Now, consider this. This is kind of a long way to think about this, but you got to be thinking in Maya's sort of digital, warped sort of way. It's one of those child toys where the objects follow those wires. Actually, using motion paths is a really easy way to build one of those, if you wanted to. And then combine that with a few deformers of your own and maybe some dynamics, and you can do all kinds of great stuff. But what we're going to do is create a motion path on the surface of our cherry, and then we're going to attach the stem to that motion path. It sounds like a long way to go about it, but the great way about working this way is that no matter how we deform our cherry, that stem will always come along for the ride. So, let's delete out this stuff. We don't need it anymore. I want you to select your cherry, which is still a NURBS curve object. I never told you to make it polygons, so if you made it polygons, you should probably go make a NURBS one real fast. It'll only take you a minute. Now, hold down the right mouse button and choose isoparm. And I want you to grab one of these longitudinal isoparms. It doesn't have to be any specific one. In fact, you can drag out your very own. It just needs to be some curve that goes from the North Pole down to the South Pole, like so. Its actual location on the surface is entirely irrelevant. So once again, just in case you need to see that, right mouse, isoparm, grab any one of these isoparms, like so. Now at this point you need to press F4, and that's going to take you to the Surfaces menu. So again, F4 Surfaces, or grab it from the drop-down. Either way, you need to go under Edit Curves and choose Duplicate Surface Curves. What this does is this makes a NURBS curve that sits right on the surface of your NURBS surface. Why is this cool? Well, it's because now if we take squash and stretch, look at this. The NURBS curve is responding in unison. It stays right on the surface at all times. How cool is that, really? If all you see is create shape from edge, then you probably have a polygon object. Oh, wait, never mind. Okay, I see what you were saying. You were just, yeah, you're making a comparison. Okay. So we now have a curve. So here's what we do. Watch this. Grab your group. Please make sure you have your group selected. So you see group cherry stem. You also need to select your NURBS curve. I like going to wireframe to make that happen. It just makes it easier to select. Now, we go to Animate, so press F2. So you got to go back to your animation menu set. Animate, Motion Paths. Now, I want you to open up the options this time around. Turn off Follow. We do not want this to follow. I really don't care what your time range is. We're not going to be using the time range anyway. So go ahead and just click Attach at that point. And if you drag the time slider, you'll probably see that your cherry is traversing your geometry, sliding along it. Now, of course, we don't want that. And here's how we're going to fix it. if you select your motion path node, you'll see it's hanging right off of your group. So it's actually an input node. So select your group and you'll see motion path 1. Notice the U value. Watch the U value while I drag the time slider. U value is just a number that goes between 0 and 1. In this case, with 0 representing the beginning of our curve, and 1 representing the end. We don't want to go from 0 to 1. We want to just stay at 0. So here's what we're going to do. Select U value, hold down the right mouse button, and choose Delete Selected. This will not delete the attribute. This deletes any animation applied to that attribute. So again, go to U value off the motion path, hold down the right mouse button, and choose Delete Selected. It's basically deleting keys. Remember, the channel box is all about animation. So now, your stem should not be moving. But, just for the fun of it, go back to your control and move your squash stretch. You create a motion path by selecting, in this case, you selected your group and your curve, which is easier to select in wireframe. Go under the Animate menu, again, that's in the Animation menu set. Go under Motion Paths, and the options that we chose in this case was just to turn off Follow. That will create your motion path. Now, how did we actually create the curve? That was easy. Select your NURB surface, hold down the right mouse button, go to Isoparm, and just grab any one of these longitudinal lines that go from the North Pole to the South Pole. It doesn't really matter which one. And you can even drag out a little arbitrary one somewhere along the way. Press F4 to go to the Surfaces menu set. Go to Edit Curves and choose Duplicate Surface Curves. And that makes the curve that you'll use to build your motion path. We are not done. We're close, but we're not done. There's one last thing that I'm going to have you do, and then the rig will be complete, and I will hand everything off to you guys. Watch this. If I take my cherry and I rotate it, look what happens. The problem is that our stem group is not rotating. It's keeping its original orientation. So we need to fix that. And it's very easy to fix, but it's important that you pay attention. My stem just decided to rescale to about 10%. All right, you've drawn the Eye of Sauron, Chris. What are you talking about? I can't hear you if you're speaking. Chris?
Hello.
Oh, hello. There you are.
Hello. Yeah.
Can you undo back
It
before
seems to have rescaled itself.
Yeah, can you undo back before all this happened?
No.
Yeah. All right, grab your group. Or open up another file.
That's just before this operation.
Yeah. What were you trying to do exactly? Wait a minute. Whoa, 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 whoa. Why are there animation keys all over that?
There are?
Geo Cherry, look at it. Look over in the channel box. Everything is red. You hit the S key while you had that guy selected. Do this. Click on Translate X, the actual word. Drag all the way to the bottom, all the way down to visibility. Then hold down the right mouse button, choose Delete Selected. Get rid of that animation. It's about halfway down. There you go. Yeah, you don't want that. You do not want there to be keyframes on that. That will cause heaven only knows what kind of problems.
All right. Cheers.
Oh, no. Show me the rest of your operation. Let's see if it happens again. Okay. Good. Well, mostly good. Do you want me to walk you through it?
No, I'm just having difficulty seeing the... oh, no. I know what I did.
It's all good, Chris. Breathe. Perfect. Wireframe will make that easier.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe not. Oh, select your surface. Select your surface, and press 1. That'll make it a little easier.
Well, that's... Oh, no, I can't remember what to do after that.
Okay, well, go ahead and select your group one more time. Now you'll...
Well, that's not good.
No, that's not good. Yeah, you've hit S when you had some geometry selected, so watch out for that. Alright, so there's the group. There's motion path 1. Click on that. Now, just delete that animation key just like you did before. So select U value, right mouse, delete selected. Boom. Now, you've got a little bit of an offset on your stem. You've got an easy fix for that, though. The curve and the locator are just part of a group. You can move them around within the group completely independently. So, if you select the curve, I would just start with the curve itself and just move that over toward the center of the stem. I'm sorry, the center of the cherry. There you go. Look at you, just center the pivot up like a pro. There you go. That works. I mean, so your stem is hanging off a little bit to one side. No big deal. And then, yeah, you can center that up as well if you want to. So there you go. You seem to be just fine now. Now, I'm not sure what sort of bug could have caused a crazy scaling. Could have had to do with the animation keys that were there, or maybe you parented to the wrong object. There are a few different options, but you seem to be good to go at this point.
All right, cheers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got the ability to squash and stretch. We now need to make sure that the stem can rotate as we rotate the cherry as well. So you want to be able to grab your cherry and rotate it, and you want the stem to come along as well. Now this is easy to do. It's very, very easy. It's just a single constraint. If you press F2 to go to your animation menu set, you'll see a constrain menu, and this gives you a variety of different constraints. A constraint is kind of like using the connection editor. It's just doing it by way of another series of nodes. You're basically saying, I want you to take, say, the translation or the rotation of one object and feed it directly to the translation or rotation of another object. You're just feeding it one straight to the other. Now, why would you use that instead of the connection editor? Well, because a constraint can actually do some other things as well that we won't necessarily explore, but are pretty powerful. However, the catch is this. You have to select the objects backwards from what you might be used to. Can anybody tell me the order in which you select objects to parent? If you're going to parent two objects together, if you want to select them in the screen, what's the order in which you select them? What comes first, the child or the parent? Who gets the cookie? Child. Ben gets the cookie. You select the child first, and then the parent. You select who is going to follow, and then who is going to lead. With constraints, you go exactly in the opposite direction. You choose the constrainor, the person that's going to lead the constraint, or the object that will lead the constraint. I don't know why I anthropomorphize everything. You'll choose the object that leads the constraint, and then the constrainee, the object that will be constrained and will follow along. So master, then slave. It's exactly the opposite of parenting. So what I want you to do is this. Go ahead and open up your hierarchy. It will make this a little easier to select for sure. Select your control. So there's your cherry control. Then, well, actually, there's cherry control. Thank you. So select your cherry control, then select the group. So not you're selecting the master first, and then the one who's going to follow along. And what we want is for the stem group to follow along with cherry control. So select cherry control, then your group. Then go to constrain and choose orient. If you did this correctly, you should be able to select your group and notice that rotate X, Y, and Z have a pale blue color to them. That means they're receiving information from a constraint. So that now, if I select my master control, look at that. The stem just comes right along. And we can still grab that locator, and waggle it around, do whatever we want to it. That's it. That is all of our rig. So what I'm going to do is not just pause the video here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video. We've completed our cherry rig. And in the next video, or the next portion, we're going to take a look at creating some animation to make it hop up on top of the cake.